Hey guys, this is Kelly of Kelly Six Stories, and I will be talking to you about my ancestry and about the results of my DNA test from ancestrydna.com. And what you will see here on this picture will be the definition of trace regions from their website. This is the estimate of my African heritage. This is the estimate of my European heritage. This is the estimate of my West Asian heritage. This is the estimate of my Central Asian heritage. On this picture, you will see the estimate of my Native American heritage.
What are you most eager to learn about your family?
I don't know, everything. All of the little stories are...
Has never heard anything about his ancestors who lived through the aftermath of slavery. So we searched for clues about his father's side of the family. The paper trail that we uncovered confounded our expectations. Unlike most African Americans who were freed by the end of the Civil War, your ancestors weren't.
They couldn't get it right.
Well,
They just stuck to it.
well, somebody didn't get it right, but it wasn't your ancestors, it was the people who owned them. Take a look at this.
Chickasaw Nation Freedmen Roll.
This document is an official enrollment card for the Chickasaw freedmen, the former slaves owned by the Chickasaw Nation.
Owned by the Chickasaw Nation.
Owned by the Chickasaw Nation. Your ancestors were enslaved by Native Americans. Here's your great-great-grandmother, Mary Kemp, her 11 children, including Bill Cheadle, your great-grandfather, William. And you can see William's father, or Hance Cheadle. You are one of the few African Americans who was not enslaved by white people, enslaved by Native Americans.
I don't know how I feel about that. It's blights on the way this country started, you know. Slavery and the genocide of the Native Americans and the Trail of Tears and all those horrible stories of what has happened to the Native people here. And then our family was owned by people who had suffered. It's just, that's mind-blowing.
Most people don't realize that the Cherokee, Creek, Seminole, Choctaw, and Chickasaw nations owned slaves. As self-governing entities, they weren't subject to the laws of the United States. So what did this mean for Don Cheadle's ancestors? When the Civil War ended, the 5 civilized tribes kept their slaves. They refused to liberate their slaves.
Everybody wanted to roll with the slavery thing as long as they could.
That's right. They said, come and get them.
Yeah, you gotta take my slave.
You got, yeah.
Pry it from my cold, dead hand.
And I had no idea.
I had neither. This is amazing.
The United States government didn't make a treaty with the Chickasaw until 1866, forcing them to liberate their slaves and make them citizens. The Chickasaws freed their slaves, but they did not offer them citizenship in the Chickasaw Nation.
Are they honorary white people? I mean, what's going on here?
Don, your ancestors were in Indian territory, yet they were neither Chickasaw nor were they Americans. They were a people without a country and without any legal status at all.
That's crazy.
Okay, guys, we're going to go over this article. I'm not going to go over the whole article, though, but you'll see what I'm doing right here. Okay, now, it says, a history of slavery and genocide is hidden in modern DNA. Genetic testing of people with Caribbean ancestry reveals evidence of indigenous population collapse and Pacific waves of slave trade. Now, this article was written by Joseph Stomberg and was published on November 15th of 2013. Okay. There are plenty of ways to study history. You can conduct archaeological digs, examining the artifacts and structures buried under the ground to learn about past lifestyles. You can read historical texts, perusing the written record to better understand events that occurred long ago. But an international group of medical researchers led by Andreas Morano Estrada and Carlos Bustamante of Stanford and Eden Martin of the University of Miami are looking instead at a decidedly unconventional historical record: human DNA. Hidden in the microscopic genetic material of people from the Caribbean, they've found is an indelible record of human history stretching back centuries to the arrival of Europeans, the decimation of Native American populations, and the transatlantic slave trade. By analyzing these genetic samples and comparing them to the genes of people around the world, they're able to pinpoint not only the geographic origin of various populations, but even the timing of when great migrations occurred. As part of the new project documented in a study published yesterday in PLOS Genetics, the researchers sampled and studied the DNA of 251 people living in Florida who had ancestry from one of the 6 countries and islands that border the Caribbean: Cuba, Haiti, Dominican Republic, Puerto Rico, Honduras, and Colombia, along with 79 residents of Venezuela who belong to one of the 3 Native American groups, the Yukpa, Wararo, and Bari tribes. Each study participant was part of a triad that included 2 parents and one of their children who were also surveyed, so the researchers could track which particular genetic markers was passed on from which parents. The researchers sequenced the DNA of these participants, analyzing their entire genomes in search of particular genetic sequences called single nucleotide polymorphisms, or SNPs for short, that often differ between unrelated individuals and are passed down from parent to child. To provide context for the SNPs they found in people from these groups and areas, they compared them to existing databases of sequenced DNA from thousands of people globally, such as data from the HapMap project. Tracing a person's DNA to a geographical area is relatively straightforward. It's well established that particular SNPs tend to occur in different frequencies in people with different ancestries. As a result, sequencing the DNA of someone living in Florida whose family came from Haiti can reveal what portion of his or her ancestors originally came from Africa and even where in Africa those people live. But one of the most amazing things about the state of modern genetics is that it also allows scientists to draw chronological conclusions about human migration because blocks of these SNPs shorten over time at a generally consistent rate. You can essentially break the genome up into European chunks, Native American chunks, and African chunks, Martin says. If each of these regions are longer, it suggests they arrived in the gene pool more recently because time tends to break up the genome. If these chunks are shorter, it suggests there's been a lot of recombination and mixing up of the gene pool of the genome, which suggests the events were longer ago. Okay, let's stop there. Now, as you guys know, I did my DNA test, and I would assume that the shorter genome that I have in my DNA will be my Asian ancestry because it came up as less than 1%. And then the second smallest percentage that I had in my DNA results was my Native American ancestry, which is 2% according to Ancestry DNA. Now, the third smallest percentage was 20 or 21% was the estimate of my European heritage and 76% of my African heritage. Now, I would assume that the largest geographical region that I have is Africa. The smallest geographical region in my DNA is Asia. which consists of both Central Asia and West Asia. And the next smallest one is America for my Native American DNA. Now, according to this information, what they're telling me that in the genome, you can break up the genome into African heritage, European heritage, Native American heritage, and also Asian heritage, even though they don't have Asian listed here. I also have Asian heritage though as well. So according to them, if the ancestry was in your bloodline the longest, or if you had gotten that ancestry from a long time ago, meaning if you got that ancestry from a long time ago, it's been in your bloodline for a very long time, then I would assume that that DNA that's been in your bloodline the longest would be the shorter SNP. And as you know, the SNP is a single nucleotide polymorphism. That single nucleotide polymorphism, that block of DNA, which is the genome, it had time to break down over time because it's been in your family, it's been in your bloodline the longest. So therefore, it's going to show up as the smallest percentage. Okay? So if that's the case, the smallest percentage for me is the Asian and Native American. So I would assume, based on this information, that that particular part of my genome must have been in my family, must have been in my bloodline for a long period of time, because as they had stated earlier, the longer the genome is, meaning the more recent the ancestry is. So therefore, I would assume that the longer genome in my DNA will be my African heritage. So, and if that's the case, then that means that my African heritage is the most recent ancestry that I have. And then the more recent ancestry that I have besides my African heritage will be my European heritage, will be the second most recent ancestry that I have in my gene pool. Okay, so that goes on to say that the biggest genome or the biggest SNP that I have in my body that's a part of my genetic material, it is my African and European heritage, which would suggest that those are my most recent ancestries. And if that's my most recent ancestries, then naturally that would mean that naturally that would make up the larger percent of my genetic code. Because the more recent your ancestry is from a particular region will naturally make up the larger percentage of your DNA. So the most recent DNA that I have is from Africa and Europe. The ancient, the more ancient ancestry, I would assume will be the Asian and Native American ancestry because it's making up the smaller percentages. So what that says to me, if I'm understanding this article right and correctly, that means that technically, originally, my family's roots would be Asian and Native American. And then what happened was the Asian and Native American people were introduced to Europeans. And then after they were introduced to the European, and the European genetic code got introduced into the Native American bloodline, then the African heritage got introduced last into the genetic code of my family history. That's what I'm assuming. And then if that's the case, then that means that Henry Louis Gates, I believe that's his name, that means that he's a fraud because he's trying to convince blacks, aka African Americans, that because their Native American ancestry is so small that they are not indeed Native Americans, when as in fact they are Native Americans because their Native American S and P will be the oldest DNA that they have in their genetic code. because it's the shorter SNP that they have in their DNA code. So, and if that's the case, which I think it is, according to this article, then that means that African Americans are in fact Native American and that they are misclassified as African American peoples and that their African heritage is their most recent heritage that was added to their genetic pool. And that also would suggest that Henry Louis Gates, that he is a fraud because he's trying to make Black people believe that they are not of Native American heritage and that they don't have any ties to America, and that the smaller percentage of Native American ancestry would suggest that their origins are not from here, and but that their true identity and their true heritage or their original heritage is that of Africa. Whereas with this article would suggest otherwise.